It all started in the middle of a busy intersection during a routine traffic stop. A man, calm and composed, sat behind the wheel of a sleek, black SUV. His presence was unassuming, yet his quiet demeanor carried an air of authority. The officer approached, his hand resting on the holster at his hip, eyes scanning the vehicle with suspicion. From the start, there was an undeniable tension in the air, unspoken, but palpable. The man rolled down the window, his steady eyes meeting the officer's gaze. Before a word could be exchanged, the officer's tone was sharp, dripping with judgment as if he had already made up his mind about the person sitting in front of him. License and registration. And make it quick. His voice was curt, barely masking an edge of hostility. The man complied, handing over the requested documents without a word. But that wasn't enough. It never is in situations like these. The officer's eyes scanned the papers, but instead of returning them, he sneered. "Whose car is this? You don't look like someone who could afford something like this. Where'd you steal it?" The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. The man's jaw tightened, his calm exterior hiding the storm brewing beneath. "It's my car," he said, his voice even, controlled. But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He saw what he wanted to see, and in his eyes, this man didn't belong behind the wheel of that car. The exchange escalated quickly. The officer's tone grew louder, more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The man hesitated for a moment, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Is there a reason for this?" "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice steady but firm. But the officer wasn't listening. To him, every word sounded like defiance. He slammed his hand against the side of the car, barking orders. "Out of the car. Don't make me drag you out." As the man stepped out, the world seemed to slow down. Bystanders turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. The officer grabbed the man by the arm, yanking him forward. "Hands on the hood," he demanded, his voice laced with authority and aggression. The man complied, his movements deliberate, his breathing steady. But his silence only seemed to fuel the officer's frustration. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" the officer sneered, his face inches away from the man's. "You think you can just waltz through my streets in this car, pretending like you belong here?" The words stung, not because they were true, but because of the venom behind them, the pure, unadulterated hatred. The tension reached its breaking point when the officer, unable to contain his growing frustration, shoved the man against the hood of the car. His voice was now a roar, echoing through the busy intersection. "I said, hands on the hood. Don't move." The man's body stiffened under the force of the officer's aggression, but his resolve didn't falter. And then, the unthinkable happened. The officer raised his fist and brought it down in a sudden, shocking act of violence, a punch aimed squarely at the man's face. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had gathered. Phones were pulled out, cameras recording the scene as the man stumbled back, clutching his face. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The man stood up straight, his hand slowly dropping from his face to reveal a trickle of blood on his lip. His calm composure was still intact, but there was a shift in his demeanor, a quiet, powerful determination that sent a ripple through the air. The officer, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, barked, "You think you're tough? You don't even know who you're messing with." And then the man spoke, his voice low but filled with an authority that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. "No, officer. You don't know who you're messing with." His words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned silence. The officer blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something in the man's tone, in the way he held himself, that suggested he was not just another victim of an abuse of power. No, this was someone different. Someone who had power of his own. The crowd, sensing the shift in dynamic, leaned in closer, their cameras still rolling. What happened next left everyone in shock. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated or humiliated. This was someone whose name, once revealed, would send shockwaves through the officer's world and beyond. The question wasn't if the officer would regret his actions, it was when. The teaser leaves you with one burning question: what happens when a man used to commanding armies is treated as less than human by someone who has no idea who he's dealing with? Stay with us as the story unfolds, because what happens next is a lesson in justice you'll never forget. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. This channel is a space where we challenge injustices through stories that inspire and empower. To every Black viewer, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Now, get ready for an emotional and powerful story that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of changemakers. Enjoy the story. The early morning light spilled across the bustling city streets, casting a golden glow over the glass buildings and weaving traffic. It was a city alive with ambition, where people of all backgrounds brushed shoulders in pursuit of their goals. Among them was Marcus Reed, a man whose presence commanded attention even in the simplest of settings. At first glance, Marcus appeared ordinary, a tall, fit man in his early 40s with deep brown skin and a clean-shaven head that reflected the morning sun. His dark, tailored suit hinted at professionalism, but it was his composure that truly set him apart. He walked with purpose, his back straight, his eyes sharp, and his stride steady. Marcus had spent over 2 decades serving in the U.S. Army, climbing the ranks with unwavering dedication and discipline. He was now a high-ranking officer, a decorated brigadier general overseeing critical operations. Yet, despite his success, Marcus was deeply private, careful to keep his personal life and achievements separate from the everyday world. He didn't flaunt his accolades, nor did he crave recognition. To Marcus, integrity and humility were values as vital as the air he breathed. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, Marcus was no stranger to adversity. His mother, Elaine, had worked 2 jobs as a nurse to support him and his younger sister, Lisa. Their father had passed away when Marcus was only 10, leaving a void that shaped much of his character. From a young age, he understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of hard work. Elaine's sacrifices fueled his determination to rise above his circumstances, not just for himself but for the family that depended on him. The city he now called home was far from the struggles of his youth, but the lessons he learned growing up never left him. Marcus often visited local schools and community centers, mentoring young men and women who, like him, faced challenges that could have easily derailed their futures. He believed in leading by example and often reminded those he mentored that success was as much about mindset as it was about opportunity. On this particular morning, Marcus was heading to an important meeting at a government facility. The day was routine in every way. He preferred to drive himself, enjoying the solitude and the opportunity to clear his mind before tackling the demands of his role. His black SUV, a modest yet reliable vehicle, reflected his personality: practical, unassuming, and efficient. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Officer Dean Harrington began his shift. Dean was a seasoned patrol officer in his mid-30s with an athletic build and a square jaw that complemented his stern demeanor. For many, Dean represented authority and control, but beneath the badge was a man who carried his own biases and frustrations. Raised in a small, predominantly white town in the Midwest, Dean had grown up with a narrow view of the world. His perception of people was shaped by stereotypes passed down from previous generations, biases he never bothered to challenge. Dean had joined the police force 10 years ago, driven by a desire for power as much as a sense of duty. Over time, the stress of the job and his own unresolved anger had hardened him. His colleagues often described him as strict and no-nonsense, but there were murmurs about his treatment of minorities during routine stops. To Dean, his actions were justified, an exaggerated sense of authority blinded him to the consequences of his behavior. As the morning wore on, Marcus navigated the streets with ease, lost in thought. He rarely worried about encounters with law enforcement. After all, he had served his country with distinction and respected the uniform. But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges, even for a man like him. As he approached a busy intersection, the sound of a police siren broke through the hum of traffic. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the flashing lights of a patrol car. Marcus calmly pulled over, rolling down his window as Officer Harrington approached. Dean's face was a mask of authority, his hand resting on his holstered firearm as he barked his first words. License and registration. The tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as if Marcus had already committed a crime. Marcus, ever composed, complied without hesitation. He handed over his documents, his expression neutral. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady and respectful. Dean barely glanced at the papers before narrowing his eyes. "Whose car is this?" he demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Looks too expensive for someone like you." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "It's my car, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" But Dean wasn't interested in answers. His mind had already made up a narrative, and no amount of logic or truth could dissuade him. "Step out of the vehicle," Dean ordered, his hand now resting on the butt of his firearm. "I'm not asking again." Marcus stepped out, his movements deliberate and careful, knowing all too well the importance of not escalating the situation. Dean's eyes scanned him from head to toe, his expression a mixture of disdain and misplaced superiority. The interaction quickly drew the attention of passers-by, their murmurs filling the air as they paused to watch the scene unfold. Dean's questions became more aggressive, each one laced with a condescension that was impossible to ignore. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Got a job interview or something?" he sneered. Marcus remained calm, his responses measured, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The situation reached its breaking point when Dean, frustrated by Marcus's composed demeanor, pushed him against the hood of the car. The crowd gasped, phones emerging to record the altercation. Dean's voice was loud, angry. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" Marcus's silence only fueled his anger. What Dean didn't know, what no one in the crowd yet realized, was that Marcus wasn't just any man. Behind his calm exterior was a leader who had faced challenges far greater than this. He had commanded troops, negotiated with world leaders, and dedicated his life to serving his country. But none of that mattered to Dean. In his eyes, Marcus was just another man to be put in his place. As the scene escalated, the air grew thick with tension. The crowd's murmurs turned into whispers of outrage, their phones capturing every moment. Marcus stood silently, his expression unreadable, as Dean's tirade continued. And then, as the officer's words grew louder and more venomous, Marcus looked up, his steady gaze meeting Dean's eyes. The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift in the dynamic. Something about Marcus's presence demanded attention, a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. What Dean didn't know, what the crowd was about to learn, was that this encounter was about to take a turn no one could have anticipated. The scene unfolded slowly, like a pot coming to a steady boil. Marcus stood next to his vehicle, his hands loosely at his sides, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their collective indignation simmering as phones captured every moment. Dean paced back and forth, his frustration spilling over in the form of sharp, cutting remarks. His voice carried over the ambient noise, harsh and unrelenting, as though he were performing for an audience. "Look at you," Dean sneered, gesturing toward Marcus as if his very existence was an offense. "Standing there like you're untouchable. You think your suit makes you someone important? Let me tell you something, you're nobody out here. Not in my city." Marcus remained silent, his gaze steady. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of the submission Dean seemed to be fishing for. This only made the officer angrier. Dean moved closer, invading Marcus's space, his voice dropping to a lower, more menacing tone. "Why don't you explain how you got this car? Did you lie on some loan application, huh? Or maybe you're running something on the side, selling things you shouldn't be selling. That's it, isn't it? Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly but said nothing. His composure, his refusal to engage, was a shield, one that was slowly chipping away at Dean's sense of control. The crowd had grown larger now, a mix of curiosity and outrage on their faces. A woman's voice broke through the murmurs, sharp and clear. "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything." Dean shot her a glare that silenced her, but the damage was done. The air was thick with tension, each moment building upon the last like a slow, grinding crescendo. Dean turned back to Marcus, his hand brushing his belt, a deliberate reminder of the weapon holstered at his side. "You think these people are going to save you? You think their little videos are going to do anything? They don't know who I am. They don't know what I can do. And you don't either." Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise like a blade. "No, officer. I don't think you know who I am." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that stopped Dean in his tracks. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across the officer's face, quickly replaced by the hardened mask of authority. He scoffed, shaking his head as if dismissing the absurdity of Marcus's statement. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," Dean shot back. "You're just another guy who thinks he's better than the rest of us. But you're not. Out here, you're nothing." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but one of quiet resolve, a signal that something was shifting beneath the surface. Dean didn't notice, or maybe he did, and it only added to his desperation to maintain control. The crowd, now emboldened by Marcus's calm defiance, began murmuring louder. Someone called out, "You're going too far," while another voice shouted, "Just let him go." Dean turned to face them, his hand raised as though to silence their growing unrest. "Stay out of this," he barked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the moment. "This doesn't concern any of you." It was becoming harder for Dean to ignore the cameras pointed at him from every angle. Sweat beaded on his forehead, the strain of his escalating actions starting to show. He turned back to Marcus, his frustration boiling over into something more volatile. "You're going to regret this," Dean hissed, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. "You think these people care about you? They'll forget about you the second this is over." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right. They might forget me. But they won't forget this." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Dean's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the tension. The crowd turned their heads in unison, the flashing lights of additional patrol cars cutting through the gathering dusk. Dean stiffened, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He had been so consumed by his need to dominate the situation that he hadn't noticed the mounting consequences. Another officer, a supervisor by the look of the insignia on his uniform, stepped out of one of the cars and made his way toward the scene. "What's going on here, Harrington?" the supervisor demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. Dean hesitated, his posture rigid, as though he were struggling to regain his footing. "Routine stop," he said quickly, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. This man was acting suspicious, and the supervisor held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His eyes moved to Marcus, taking in the man's composed demeanor and the faint traces of blood on his lip. There was no need to ask what had happened, the truth was written all over Marcus's face, and in the crowd's disapproving stares. The supervisor's voice dropped, measured but firm. "Harrington, step aside. Now." Dean hesitated, his grip tightening on his belt, but the weight of the supervisor's authority left him with no choice. He stepped back, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Marcus, still calm, met the supervisor's gaze. There was a brief moment of understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the events that had transpired. The crowd began to murmur again, their anticipation reaching a fever pitch. Something was about to happen, something that none of them could have predicted. The supervisor turned to Marcus, his tone respectful but cautious. "Sir, I'd like to speak with you privately, if that's all right." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. The crowd watched as he followed the supervisor to the side, their whispers growing louder with speculation. Dean stood frozen in place, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. As the scene unfolded, the tension in the air was palpable. The crowd, the officers, even Dean himself could sense that this moment was the calm before the storm. What would come next would change everything, not just for Marcus and Dean, but for everyone watching. The question wasn't if justice would be served. It was how. And the answer was closer than anyone could have imagined. The air hung heavy as Marcus stood by the side of the patrol car, his expression calm yet unreadable. The supervisor had requested a private word, but the intensity of the moment meant nothing was truly private. The crowd was still watching, their phones capturing every movement, every word. Dean lingered near his own vehicle, his posture tense as he watched Marcus and the supervisor interact. There was a nervous energy to his stance now, a man desperately trying to hold on to the last vestiges of control. The supervisor, Officer Martin, was older, with a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested decades of experience dealing with tense situations. His eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as he looked at Marcus, but he maintained his professionalism. "Sir," Martin began carefully, his voice low enough to avoid carrying to the crowd but firm enough to demand attention, "I need to understand exactly what happened here." Marcus met his gaze, his tone even and deliberate. "What happened," he said slowly, "is that your officer decided to act on assumptions instead of facts. He escalated a situation that should never have existed in the first place." Martin nodded slightly, as if expecting the response, but his expression remained guarded. "I understand that, sir, and I assure you will conduct a full investigation. But I need your cooperation to get the details right." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. There was a moment of silence as he seemed to weigh his next words carefully. Then, in a voice that carried just enough for the nearby onlookers to hear, he said, "Do you even know who I am?" Martin blinked, caught off guard by the question. Dean, standing a few feet away, scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, loud enough to draw a few murmurs from the crowd. "Another guy trying to play the victim." Marcus didn't look at Dean, but his words were clearly meant for him as much as for Martin. "I'm Brigadier General Marcus Reed. I've served this country for over 20 years. I've led men and women into battle, negotiated with foreign dignitaries, and advised leaders at the highest levels of government. And today, your officer decided to treat me like a criminal because of the color of my skin." The revelation landed like a thunderclap. The crowd, which had been buzzing with quiet murmurs, fell silent. Even the other officers seemed momentarily stunned, their postures shifting as the weight of Marcus's words sank in. Dean's face turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw tightening as he processed what had just been said. "That's a lie," Dean spat, stepping forward aggressively. "You're making this up to save face. A general? Really? In that car? Dressed like that? You think anyone here is going to believe that?" Martin turned sharply toward Dean, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Harrington, stand down," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dean hesitated, his hands clenching into fists, but he eventually stepped back, though the defiance in his eyes remained. Marcus, unfazed by Dean's outburst, turned his attention back to Martin. "You can verify my identity," he said simply. "Run my name. Call your precinct. It won't take long." Martin hesitated for only a moment before signaling to another officer. The younger man nodded, stepping away to check the records. The minutes that followed were tense, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional murmur from the crowd. Dean shifted uncomfortably, his confidence eroding with every passing second. Finally, the officer returned, his expression tense as he handed a tablet to Martin. Martin scanned the screen, his eyes widening slightly before he looked back at Marcus. There was no doubt now, everything Marcus had said was true. The supervisor straightened his posture, his tone shifting to one of respect. "General Reed," he said carefully, "on behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for—" Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not interested in apologies, Officer Martin. What I want is accountability. Your officer's behavior today was unacceptable, and I won't let this slide." Dean stepped forward again, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're just another guy trying to pull rank. You think your title means anything out here? It doesn't. Out here, you're just another." "Enough," Marcus said sharply, his voice cutting through Dean's rant like a knife. For the first time, there was a hint of anger in his tone, a crack in the composure he had maintained all day. "I've spent my life defending this country, including people like you who think their badge makes them invincible. But your badge doesn't protect you from the consequences of your actions. Not today." The crowd erupted into murmurs again, their outrage now directed squarely at Dean. Martin turned to him, his face a mask of fury. "Harrington, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." Dean's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're kidding me," he said, his voice rising. "You're going to take his word over mine? After everything I've done for this department?" Martin didn't waver. "This isn't about taking sides, Harrington. It's about doing what's right. You crossed a line, and now you're going to face the consequences." As Dean reluctantly handed over his badge and weapon, the crowd erupted into cheers. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the weight of the day seemed to lift, but there was still a lingering tension in the air. Martin turned back to Marcus, his tone careful. "General, I'll make sure this is handled properly." "You have my word." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "See that it is. And make sure your department learns from this." As Marcus turned to leave, the crowd parted to let him through, their phones still recording. He didn't look back, but the impact of his words and actions lingered in the air. This was more than just an incident, it was a turning point, a moment that would leave its mark on everyone who witnessed it. And for Dean, it was a reckoning that would change his life forever. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as the supervisor led Marcus away from the commotion, their steps steady but deliberate. The crowd continued to murmur behind them, a mix of frustration and curiosity at what was happening. Marcus, despite everything, maintained his calm demeanor, though his silence now carried the weight of impending action. Dean stood frozen in place, his mind racing with anger and confusion. His fists clenched at his sides, the realization that he was losing control gnawed at him like an open wound. As Marcus and the supervisor stopped a short distance away, the older officer turned to face him, his expression a mix of concern and respect. There was no denying that Marcus carried himself differently, and the supervisor's instincts told him this wasn't just another traffic stop gone wrong. "Sir, I apologize for what's happened here today," he began carefully, his tone measured but sincere. "I need to understand what's going on so we can resolve this." Marcus didn't speak immediately, letting the moment stretch just long enough for the supervisor to sense the gravity of the situation. When he finally did, his voice was calm but firm, every word deliberate. "What's going on," Marcus said, "is an abuse of power. Your officer decided to humiliate me, accuse me of crimes I didn't commit, and escalate the situation to violence, all because he made assumptions about who I am." The supervisor straightened slightly, his face tightening as Marcus's words landed. "I understand," he replied carefully, "and I assure you, there will be an investigation into his behavior. This doesn't represent how we operate." Marcus's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locked on the supervisor's. "I'm not here to listen to excuses or promises of investigations that never go anywhere. What I want to know is if your department is prepared to deal with the consequences of what's happened today. The supervisor hesitated, his brow furrowing. What do you mean, consequences? Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel more personal, more intense. I mean that your officer assaulted a senior-ranking member of the United States Army. I mean that the person he decided to humiliate and accuse is someone who has dedicated their entire career to serving this country. And I mean that, as of now, I have every right to ensure this becomes a national issue. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, their meaning slowly sinking in. The supervisor's eyes widened slightly, a flash of realization crossing his face. You're in the army, he said, his voice faltering for the first time. Marcus nodded, his expression unchanging. I'm a brigadier general in the army. I've led thousands of men and women in service. I've been in war zones, negotiated peace, and made decisions that have shaped this nation's security. And your officer thought it was acceptable to treat me like a criminal because of the color of my skin. The supervisor's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His gaze darted back toward the scene where Dean stood, still frozen in place, his confidence eroding with each passing second. General, the supervisor finally said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and regret, I didn't know. He didn't know. That's the problem, Marcus said, his voice cutting like a blade. He didn't care to know. He didn't stop to think that maybe the person in front of him wasn't who he assumed. That's the problem with people like him. They act without accountability, without consequences. But today, there will be consequences. The supervisor seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of Marcus's words, the realization of the situation pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. Sir, I assure you, we will take immediate action against Officer Harrington. His behavior was unacceptable, and it won't go unpunished. Marcus's gaze didn't soften. It's not just about punishment. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, to anyone. I've been through enough in my life to know that silence doesn't change anything. Today, I'm not going to be silent. The supervisor nodded, his expression serious now, as though he finally understood the gravity of the moment. Understood, General. What do you want us to do? Before Marcus could respond, a voice broke through the tension, a voice laced with desperation and anger. Dean had stepped forward, his face red with a mix of frustration and disbelief. You've got to be kidding me, he spat, his voice louder than it should have been. You're telling me this guy is some big shot in the army? You expect me to believe that? Marcus turned slowly, his expression unreadable, as Dean continued his tirade. This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job. He was acting suspicious, driving around like he owns the place. How was I supposed to know he's, whatever he says he is? The crowd, still watching, began to murmur louder, their disapproval clear. The supervisor raised a hand, his voice firm. Officer Harrington, that's enough. But Dean wasn't listening. He took another step forward, pointing a finger at Marcus. This is a setup. That's what this is. You're just trying to make me look bad. But I didn't do anything wrong. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority that silenced everyone around him. You didn't do anything wrong, he repeated, his tone carrying a quiet power that made Dean falter. You used your position to humiliate and assault someone who had done nothing to warrant it. You made assumptions about me because it was easier for you to see me as a threat than as a human being. And now that you're being held accountable, you want to play the victim. Dean opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd watched in silence, their attention fixed on Marcus as he took a step closer to Dean. Let me tell you something, Officer Harrington. I've spent my life dealing with people like you. People who think they can act without consequences, who think their power makes them untouchable. But you're about to learn what accountability really looks like. The tension in the air was electric, every word from Marcus cutting through the silence like thunder. Dean's bravado crumbled, his posture sagging as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The crowd murmured, their disapproval turning into quiet anticipation. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. The street buzzed with a tension that refused to dissipate. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had unfolded. Officer Harrington stood rooted to the spot, his face a mixture of disbelief and barely masked fear. The crowd, still gathered, whispered among themselves, their phones recording every second. This wasn't just an ordinary confrontation anymore, it was a moment that would ripple far beyond the boundaries of this intersection. Marcus stood tall, his calm demeanor unwavering even as the storm around him continued to churn. His measured words from moments earlier had shifted the balance of power so drastically that even those watching felt the impact. Dean's bluster had given way to visible uncertainty, his eyes darting between Marcus and the crowd as though searching for an escape route. But there was none. The supervisor broke the silence first, his voice firm but carrying a tone of measured diplomacy. "Officer Harrington, return to the vehicle. Now." There was no room for argument in his command, but Dean didn't move immediately. His pride was too deeply wounded, and the reality of his situation was only just beginning to sink in. He hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching, before he finally took a step back, his movements slow and reluctant. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a collective response to the visible unraveling of a man who had once stood so confident in his authority. Some voices were tinged with anger, others with curiosity, and still others with a cautious hope that perhaps, this time, justice might actually be served. Marcus turned his gaze back to the supervisor, his expression steady but firm. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to still the crowd. "Not for him. Not for this department. This moment doesn't end here, and it doesn't end with a simple reprimand." The supervisor nodded, his face set in grim understanding. He wasn't a man prone to excuses or empty promises, he knew the gravity of the situation demanded more than platitudes. "General Reed," he began, his tone respectful, "I can't undo what's happened here today, but I give you my word that we'll address this thoroughly." Marcus didn't reply immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, his gaze unflinching. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "I'll hold you to that. But let me be clear, this isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been subjected to this kind of treatment without the privilege of having an audience, without the privilege of a title. This isn't just your department's issue. It's a systemic issue." The supervisor nodded again, his expression tightening as the weight of Marcus's words settled over him. "I understand," he said quietly, though the look in his eyes suggested he was only beginning to grasp the full scope of the reckoning ahead. As the interaction unfolded, Dean stood by the patrol car, his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the ground. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The crowd was no longer whispering, their voices had grown louder, their collective presence a reminder of the accountability he could no longer avoid. The phones pointed in his direction felt like 100 spotlights, each one capturing the slow, steady unraveling of a man who had once seen himself as untouchable. But for Marcus, the moment wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about something deeper, something more enduring. He wasn't here to tear a man down, he was here to expose a system that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but Marcus had carried heavier burdens before. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their curiosity satisfied but their thoughts heavy. Many of them had come as witnesses to an injustice, and they left as witnesses to something far greater. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the supervisor. "I'll expect to hear from your department soon," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The supervisor nodded, his respect for the man in front of him clear. "You will," he replied, his voice steady. Marcus gave a single, deliberate nod before walking back to his vehicle. The crowd had thinned considerably, but a few people lingered, their eyes following him as he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to fight for. Dean remained by the patrol car, his head bowed, his earlier defiance replaced by a quiet resignation. As Marcus opened the door to his SUV, he paused, his hand resting on the frame. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the scene one last time. There was no triumph in his expression, no hint of satisfaction. This wasn't a victory. It was a step forward, but the road ahead was still long. The sound of the engine broke the silence, and Marcus drove away, leaving behind a moment that would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For the crowd, it was a moment of reckoning. For the supervisor, it was a moment of accountability. And for Dean, it was a moment of profound, life-altering consequence. But for Marcus, it was something more. It was a reminder of why he had chosen a life of service, why he had dedicated himself to the ideals of justice and equality even when the world around him seemed determined to undermine them. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't over, not for him, not for the people he represented, and not for the system that had allowed such moments to exist in the first place. As the city lights blurred past his window, Marcus's mind was already turning to the next steps. He wasn't the type to let moments like this fade into the background. He knew the importance of turning outrage into action, of transforming a single event into a catalyst for change. And he knew that this moment, as painful and as infuriating as it had been, was an opportunity to do what he had always done, lead. The hours after the incident felt like a haze, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Marcus had returned to his home, a modest yet meticulously maintained house on a quiet suburban street. The stillness of the space stood in stark contrast to the chaos of earlier events, but Marcus's mind was far from quiet. He sat at the edge of his desk in the study, his fingers steepled as he stared at a blank notepad. The faint hum of a distant lawnmower and the chirping of birds outside did little to distract him. His phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with a flurry of notifications. Videos of the confrontation had gone viral, and messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Some expressed outrage at the officer's behavior. Others praised Marcus's composure. But what caught his attention was a message from an old friend and former colleague, Colonel Richard Keller. The text was brief: "Saw what happened. Call me when you're ready." Marcus exhaled deeply, running a hand over his head. The weight of the day was pressing down on him, but he knew this wasn't over. He dialed Richard's number, and it only took a single ring before the familiar voice of his friend came through the line. "Marcus," Richard said, his tone carrying equal parts concern and admiration. "I saw the video. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though his voice carried a weariness that didn't go unnoticed. "Physically, at least." "Physically," Richard repeated, his voice softening. "But not otherwise. Marcus, I've known you long enough to know when something's eating at you. Talk to me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. "It's not about me, Richard. It's about the fact that this keeps happening. I'm one person. I had the privilege of having an audience, a title, and a platform to push back. But how many people have been in my position and walked away with nothing but humiliation? How many times has this played out without a crowd to hold anyone accountable?" Richard was silent for a moment, letting Marcus's words sink in. "You're right," he said finally. "And that's exactly why you need to do something about this. You have a voice, Marcus. People will listen to you." "That's the plan," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But it's not just about speaking out. It's about ensuring there are real, lasting consequences, not just for that officer, but for the culture that allows people like him to thrive. This isn't just about one man's actions. It's about dismantling the system that enables it." Richard let out a low whistle. "That's a tall order, my friend. But if anyone can take it on, it's you. Just tell me what you need." "I'll let you know," Marcus replied, his tone softening. For now, I need to take some time to think, to figure out the best way to move forward. After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence for a long while. His thoughts swirled with the weight of responsibility and the knowledge that this moment, as painful as it had been, was an opportunity to create something better. He wasn't naive about the challenges ahead. He knew there would be resistance, backlash, and attempts to discredit him. But he also knew that this was a fight worth having. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Dean Harrington sat alone in the break room, his head in his hands. The once confident officer now looked like a man unraveling at the seams. The weight of his actions, combined with the public scrutiny they had drawn, was crushing him. The supervisor had already informed him that an internal investigation was underway, and he had been placed on administrative leave. But it wasn't just his job that was at stake. His name, his reputation, and his future were all on the line. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see the supervisor standing in the doorway. The older man's expression was stern, his arms crossed over his chest. "Officer Harrington," the supervisor said, his tone measured but unyielding. "We need to talk." Dean nodded reluctantly, rising to his feet and following the supervisor to his office. The atmosphere was heavy with tension as the door closed behind them. The supervisor gestured for Dean to sit, but he remained standing, his posture rigid. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," the supervisor began, his voice low but firm. "What happened today was unacceptable. Your behavior was not only a violation of our department's policies, but it's also put this entire precinct under a microscope. Do you understand the gravity of the situation you've created?" Dean swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just doing my job." "Doing your job," the supervisor shot back, his tone sharp. "You assaulted an innocent man based on nothing but your own prejudices. And not just any man, a brigadier general in the army. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" Dean's shoulders sagged, the weight of the supervisor's words pressing down on him. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered, his voice tinged with desperation. "That's not the point," the supervisor said, his tone unrelenting. "It's not about who he is. It's about what you did. And now, not only is this department facing public outrage, but we're also dealing with a potential lawsuit, federal scrutiny, and a PR nightmare." Dean sank into the chair, his head in his hands. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and for the first time, he realized just how deep the consequences of his actions ran. But beneath the regret and fear was something else, an uncomfortable, nagging question about the choices that had led him to this point. As the hours stretched into the evening, the ripples of the day's events continued to spread. For Marcus, for Dean, and for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation, this was a turning point. But the full impact of what had happened was still unfolding, and the road ahead remained uncertain. Marcus knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and Dean, for the first time, began to grapple with the weight of his actions. The consequences were only beginning to take shape, and what came next would define not only their futures but the broader conversation about accountability and change. The next morning, the world seemed to awaken with a renewed intensity. News outlets had picked up the story, and the video of the confrontation between Marcus and Dean was spreading rapidly. Headlines screamed words like abuse of power and military officer humiliated by police, while talk shows dissected every frame of the footage. Social media was a storm of opinions, some condemning Dean's actions and others defending the police. For Marcus, this was no longer just about what had happened to him, it was about what could be done to prevent it from happening again. Marcus sat in his study, his laptop open to a stream of emails and messages. Offers for interviews, invitations to speak at events, and words of encouragement poured in from all corners. Yet he wasn't ready to respond. He needed to approach this carefully, deliberately, and with a clear sense of purpose. His phone buzzed, and the name on the screen made him pause. It was Colonel Richard Keller again, persistent as ever. Marcus answered, his voice steady but weary. Richard, I'm in the middle of sorting through all this. What's on your mind? What's on my mind is that you're sitting on a powder keg, Richard replied without hesitation. This thing has legs, Marcus. People are watching, listening, waiting to see what you're going to do next. Don't let this moment slip away. Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. I know. But it's not as simple as just stepping in front of a camera and talking. If this is going to mean something, it has to be more than a headline. Richard's voice softened, but his conviction remained. Then make it more. Use your voice, your platform, your position. You've spent your life leading, Marcus. This is no different. The only question is whether you're ready to lead this fight. The words hung in the air long after the call ended, leaving Marcus deep in thought. He wasn't one to rush into decisions, but he knew Richard was right. This wasn't just about him, it was about the people who didn't have the privilege or the power to fight back. It was about ensuring that this moment became a catalyst for change. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Dean Harrington was beginning to feel the full weight of the fallout. The investigation into his actions had officially begun, and he had been called in for questioning. The once confident officer now sat in a sterile room, his hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of him. Across from him sat a pair of internal affairs investigators, their expressions unreadable. Officer Harrington, one of them began, his tone neutral but firm, we've reviewed the footage of the incident, and we've heard statements from witnesses. We need to understand your perspective. What were you thinking during the encounter? Dean shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. What could he say that wouldn't make things worse? I was following protocol, he said finally, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. The man was acting suspicious, and I needed to ensure the situation was under control. The second investigator, a woman with piercing eyes, leaned forward slightly. Suspicious? In what way? Dean hesitated, his jaw tightening. He was driving an expensive car in an area where we've had issues with car theft. I thought it warranted further investigation. And did he give you any indication that he was a threat? The woman pressed, her tone sharp. Did he resist your commands? Was there anything in his behavior that justified the escalation? Dean's silence was deafening. The truth was, he had nothing to say. The investigators exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. Officer Harrington, the first investigator, said, his tone now laced with disappointment, your actions have put this entire department under scrutiny. This isn't just about one bad decision. It's about a pattern of behavior that has no place in law enforcement. The words hit Dean like a punch to the gut. He had always seen himself as untouchable, as someone who could operate without consequences. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he was beginning to see the cracks in the foundation he had built his life upon. As Dean grappled with his own reckoning, Marcus was taking the first steps toward action. He had agreed to an interview with a major news network, knowing it was the best way to amplify his message. The studio was a flurry of activity when he arrived, cameras being adjusted and microphones clipped into place. The anchor, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for tough but fair interviews, greeted him warmly. General Reed, thank you for being here, she said, her voice genuine. I know this must be a difficult time for you. Marcus nodded, his expression calm. Thank you for having me. It's important that we talk about this. As the cameras began to roll, the anchor wasted no time. General Reed, the footage of your encounter with Officer Harrington has sparked a national conversation about police conduct and systemic bias. How do you feel about the attention this has received? Marcus took a deep breath before answering. It's not about how I feel, he said, his voice steady. It's about what this moment represents. This isn't just my story, it's the story of countless others who have faced similar situations without the benefit of an audience or a platform. What happened to me is part of a larger issue, and we can't afford to ignore it. The anchor nodded, her expression serious. What do you hope will come out of this? I hope for accountability, Marcus replied without hesitation. Not just for the officer involved, but for the system that allowed his actions to go unchecked. We need to address the root causes of these issues: training, culture, and the lack of accountability that has plagued law enforcement for far too long. The interview continued, each question delving deeper into Marcus's thoughts and experiences. By the time it ended, the room was silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air. As he left the studio, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about responding to what had happened, it was about shaping what came next. Back at the precinct, Dean sat in his car, staring at the dashboard. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind a whirlwind of regret, anger, and confusion. For the first time, he began to question the choices that had led him here. The badge he had once worn with pride now felt like a burden, a symbol of everything he had taken for granted. The paths of Marcus and Dean, though worlds apart, were now irreversibly intertwined. The consequences of their actions were rippling outward, touching lives and igniting conversations far beyond their immediate circles. But the story was far from over. The choices they made in the days and weeks ahead would determine the legacy of this moment, and whether it would lead to true change or fade into the background like so many others before it. The aftermath of the incident rippled far beyond the streets where it had unfolded. Marcus Reed, now a prominent voice in the national conversation about systemic bias and accountability in law enforcement, found himself at the forefront of change. Weeks after the viral confrontation, Marcus stood on the steps of a congressional building, surrounded by advocates, activists, and lawmakers. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the assembled crowd as Marcus prepared to deliver a speech that would mark a turning point in his journey. He spoke with the calm authority that had become his hallmark, addressing not just the events of that fateful day but the broader issues that had allowed it to happen. His words carried the weight of lived experience and a deep understanding of the stakes. He called for comprehensive reform, urging those in power to take meaningful action to address the systemic flaws that perpetuated injustice. The crowd listened intently, their applause growing louder with every impassioned statement. The speech was broadcast live, and its impact was immediate. News outlets praised Marcus's leadership, and social media platforms lit up with support for his cause. But Marcus wasn't interested in personal accolades. His focus remained on the work ahead, on ensuring that the momentum generated by this moment didn't fade into complacency. He partnered with organizations dedicated to justice reform, lending his voice and influence to campaigns aimed at bringing about real, lasting change. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Dean Harrington faced a very different reality. The internal investigation concluded with a scathing report that highlighted a pattern of misconduct and a failure to uphold the standards of his position. Dean was formally dismissed from the police force, his badge and weapon taken away in a quiet but final ceremony that underscored the gravity of his actions. For Dean, it was a moment of reckoning unlike anything he had ever experienced. Stripped of his authority and the career that had once defined him, Dean was left to confront the choices that had brought him to this point. The support he had once taken for granted dwindled, and the consequences of his actions began to seep into every corner of his life. Friends distanced themselves, and his reputation in the community was irreparably damaged. Yet, amidst the fallout, something began to shift within Dean. He couldn't shake the memory of Marcus's words, the calm but firm resolve with which the man had addressed him. For the first time in his life, Dean found himself questioning his own biases, his assumptions, and the way he had wielded power. Months later, Dean appeared on a small community panel, sharing his story not as a cautionary tale but as an admission of guilt and a plea for change. His voice trembled as he spoke, but there was no mistaking the sincerity of his words. He acknowledged the harm he had caused and the privilege he had abused, expressing a desire to learn, to listen, and to contribute to the conversations about reform. While forgiveness wasn't guaranteed, his willingness to confront his past marked the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward redemption. For Marcus, the end of this chapter wasn't a conclusion but a continuation of his mission. He returned to his role in the military with a renewed sense of purpose, using his platform to advocate for equity and justice both within and beyond the armed forces. His efforts extended to mentoring young officers, emphasizing the importance of integrity and accountability in positions of authority. Marcus's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of speaking truth to power, inspiring countless others to take action in their own communities. As the dust settled and the headlines shifted to new stories, the lessons of this moment remained etched in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. The confrontation between Marcus and Dean was no longer just a viral video or a fleeting controversy, it was a catalyst for change, a reminder of the work that remained, and a testament to the courage it took to stand up against injustice. This story isn't just about Marcus Reed or Dean Harrington. It's about the systems that shape us, the choices we make, and the impact those choices have on others. It's about the power of accountability, the possibility of redemption, and the responsibility we all share in creating a more just and equitable society. Now, what about you? How did this story make you feel? Were you inspired by Marcus's resolve or challenged by Dean's journey? Did it make you think about the world around you and the ways we can all contribute to positive change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke reflection, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Join our community and be part of the conversations that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.